John Hook's Newsmaker starts now.
Welcome to Newsmaker. I'm Steve Nielsen in for John Hook. Just how good is ASU football? We're just days away from the Peach Bowl, and they're so good, they might actually be changing state law. It's a pretty big sentence right there, but lawmakers at the Capitol are considering it right now. So let's go ahead and bring in our first guest, State Senator T.J. Shope. Senator, we've been talking about this a few days ago. We're continuing this conversation. Kenny Dillingham's a really good head football coach, isn't he?
Yeah, it really does seem to be. And to get ASU into a position where preseason pick number 16, I think we've all, especially we live in the Valley like we do, have heard it over and over and over again. 16th and finishes first. And not just finishes first, but in a convincing blowout victory against Iowa State. And obviously getting that perfect position to be the number 4 seed in the playoff and be at the Peach Bowl in Atlanta coming up pretty quick.
We've talked about this before. You graduated ASU 08. I graduated 09. So we saw a lot of the same football teams. We actually saw some pretty good football. It wasn't bad football.
We did. And I mean, we had Todd Graham with 3 back-to-back 10-win seasons, which hadn't been done in a really long time. I think, Dennis Erickson had a good season there until the wheels fell off. And even Herm Edwards, as much as a criticism I think many of us lobbed his way, left or started off in a positive direction, maybe didn't leave the program in great shape, obviously, which led us to a guy who bleeds as much maroon and gold, I think, as you and I do. And that's a huge positive. A guy that has grown up here in the Phoenix area, a guy went to Arizona State and really got a kickoff on his coaching career after suffering a pretty bad injury, I guess, in his playing days, and he still wanted to be involved in football. And my goodness, I hope he's involved in football for as long as he wants to be.
Well, and I mean, when we look back at the start of those 10 years you just mentioned, Todd Graham, Dennis Erickson, Dirk Cutter before him, and then,
Right.
Herm, none of them felt this way, I think. There's something that feels a little magical about being in the college football playoff that I'm not sure the Valley's felt since that Rose Bowl team.
Well, I tell you, as many of us have done late Christmas shopping, which I'm sure nobody watching this program is. I'm not going to accuse anyone out there watching this that they're doing that as well.
No.
But open your eyes and see how many people are sporting their Sun Devil gear. People that, you didn't used to see that very often in and around the Valley, and you'd probably be just as likely to see somebody wearing a U of A a football or basketball shirt around too. So look, the Sun Devil Nation is awake and alive. I was watching the basketball team beat up on UMass a couple days ago, and there was a pretty sizable contingent of ASU fans there in New England following along. And I have to believe that a lot of that is just a desire to be involved with all things ASU at the moment. I spoke to folks at Cactus Sports, for example, in Tempe, and folks associated with the Sun Devil bookstore on campus, and the sales right now are through the roof. People want anything that they can get their hands on that has Sparky or a pitchfork on it, and that's a great thing because obviously, since Sparky and that fork are registered trademarks of ASU, they're going to get a little cut of the proceeds from that, and that's great. That I know that'll be turned right around to the student athletes who are working their tails off to make sure that Arizona State's competitive.
Well, I think that leads us to where we're talking about on this state law. You mentioned when ASU football is good, that is good for the economy typically. We see that in a lot of different ways. Right now, Arizona is a bit of a quirk compared to other states out there in the country. We have a law that says a state employee's max contract can be 5 years. A state employee includes a head football coach of ASU, of NAU, U of A. So we're talking about this national picture right here of where college athletics is at. You just saw Curt Cignetti at Indiana. They bowed out early out of the college football playoff, but he just signed an 8-year deal for $8 million a year. And he just had the same turnaround with Indiana that ASU just had. So you got to think the market rate for Kenny Dillingham is going to be something like that. But the max contract is 5 years for Kenny Dillingham. Are you looking to change that? Are you trying to get more years added?
Yeah, so the desire is, as we look at especially Indiana, I mean, my goodness, a program that at least we've had a year here and a year there of success. Indiana obviously has gone through decades of being at the bottom, along with schools like Northwestern in the Big Ten Conference. Um, in Arizona's case, yes, we view, at least I view, and many others that are involved in looking at college athletics, and this includes, I want to make it clear, I know we're celebrating ASU right now, but U of A has traditionally had, whether it's Mike Candrea in softball or Lute Olson in basketball and others who have been every bit as successful, if not more, in some cases, that in order to keep us from having to sign a blockbuster multi-million-dollar deal because the contract length is only 5 years allowable by law. Let's allow for a longer contract term where you don't have to front load it with the amount of dollars, thereby saving the university and really the athletics program. I think one of the biggest misnomers comes from what just was discussed, and it's not. They are, yes, technically an employee of the state of Arizona. The salaries are not really funded by the taxpayers of the state of Arizona. These salaries are funded internally by the athletics programs at the three universities essentially in the state of Arizona.
Is there concern and pushback, though, especially from your fellow legislators, that they're going to say, listen, this is money that we could be talking about with teacher contracts. This is money that we go in other places. Why are we so concerned about Kenny Dillingham's contract?
I fully expect that conversation to take place. A lot of it's going to be education to let people understand where these dollars come from that pay for a men's basketball coach at a university, or a head football coach, or a baseball coach at a university. Generally you have the revenue producing sports such as football and basketball that essentially make the money for the athletic programs across the other intercollegiate sports at the university. So in essence, we're allowing for, Kenny Dillingham is driving the conversation, but what he's really doing is driving the increase in resources that are now going to be available for the other sports at the university that may have had to use different resources in the past. I think it's a positive overall for the 8 years. It truly does allow for a young guy like Ken to go ahead and plan out what the future looks like, instead of, and not just for him, but if you're in his position and you are the guy, you feel pretty safe. But your assistant coaches, they realize that they may have that 5 year cap as well, just by default of coaching under Dillingham. But they also are looking around. They may get scooped up by another. Everybody's friends in this business has worked for somebody, right? They may get scooped up by a guy that they worked for 10 years earlier in a school that doesn't have a cap, and that looks very attractive from a familial point of view. If you can tell your spouse or significant other that, hey, look, the place we're going to next, we don't have to worry about it. We're there for the long haul.
I talked with Chris Cartman over at SunDevilSource.com about our conversation here, and he said this is champagne problems for ASU. I mean, you're talking about being in a position where you got a coach that you want to keep past 5 years. That's pretty rare territory for ASU, so it's a unique situation. I think it's important to say, while these negotiations are currently going on between the athletic department, Graham Rossini, and Kenny Dillingham and his agent, this law that you're talking about wouldn't go into effect first, if it passes, until 90 days after the session. So we're talking next football season. So
that's correct. So whatever they're negotiating right now, best of luck. I obviously, we would like to keep him, and if it's the 5 years that's allowable, then fantastic. That's something we have to get done. What this is completely separate from that, obviously, and something that I think shows a commitment. We're not talking about a superintendent at a school, or the university president, or something like that. We're talking about somebody who truly gets their salary out of a source that's not necessarily anything that's taxpayer related. And that's why I feel comfortable that in that special circumstance, we can have a special, different type of area of the law that takes that under consideration. And I think that we would be wise to do it.
Senator Shope, appreciate you joining us. Before I say goodbye to you, though, really important here. We got the Texas-Arizona State Peach Bowl game coming up in a couple days. I need a score prediction from you.
Oh, well, first off, I think the 13.5 right now is way too wide.
Way too wide.
Way too wide. But I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'll say Arizona State with a 38-35 victory.
38-35. I think that's so important. There's so much behind ASU in the college football playoff, just representing not just the Big 12, but basically representing everyone that isn't the Big 10 and the SEC.
Right.
I think it's important ASU keep it at least close. If they lose, at least make it a game. Because if that happens, it proves these other conferences, these other teams that aren't these blue bloods of Ohio State and, the Georgias of the world. We belong too, right?
I agree. And I got to say, Texas doesn't look as good as I think everybody believes. It just happens to be that they're on national television every weekend. So people get to see them. And indoors, I really like our chances with Scadaboo being able to cut up field and Levitt being able to show off the arm. So I think we have a really good shot of winning this thing.
Fingers crossed for a good game. I think that's what we all want.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. All right, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, how to leave a cult. It's a very interesting question. We're going to talk with someone who says that she was a member of a cult in the state of Arizona, and she has tips on how to get out. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newsmaker. We wanted to take a deep dive for this next segment into a story we first brought you earlier this year, how to leave a cult. It's a tremendous undertaking, especially for somebody who is raised in a cult. But before we bring in our next guest, let's take a look back at how she got to this moment. Flipping through a childhood of photos, everything seems normal.
We celebrated Halloween, we celebrated Easter.
Brooke Walker sees it differently now. She says she was raised in a cult.
Were you a part of a cult?
Oh, 100%, unfortunately.
As an 8-year-old girl, her parents moved her family to a Mason neighborhood to live with another family and join the Church of Immortal Consciousness.
Looking for faith, but also looking for something different than what they had, the mainstream stuff.
What they found was a church leader and medium who said she could speak with and summon a 14th century Englishman named Dr. Duran.
Where you could be incredibly heavily corrected by the spirit for what you're doing. You create this belief set that anything that goes sideways must be your fault.
She played for us her recording of what they called a trance.
You have to sing to raise the energy. And so we would get told to sing until Duran came through.
Eventually, the church leader would speak as Duran.
Wondering if you are in search of your past lives.
I'm surprised on the amount of power that it used to hold over me.
The church headed north. About 150 members lived in Tonto Village. Brooke turned 19 and was in an arranged marriage arranged by Dr. Duran. The wedding was in this room, officiated by the 700-year-old spirit.
You're going to be in a relationship with who the spirit tells you you're going to be in a relationship with.
Brooke says after 2 babies, her husband left, telling her he needed to get out.
Everybody continues to tell me after that, it's about you. He just doesn't love you and he won't tell you the truth. So I spent 10 years believing that.
Now, things are different.
Last episode, we talked about...
Brooke lives in Gilbert, happy with her new life. And now she spends her time in front of a microphone.
I'm here for you, and I'm here to support you, and I'm here to share with you a space that you can get past that. So
she started this podcast out of her house called How to Leave a Cult.
To me, it's about creating a place where people feel like they can get some tools to heal. People think of a cult and they immediately go to the worst of them, right? You know, the drink the Kool-Aid, the Jim Jones type of stuff, the Waco stuff.
She says the church she was raised in wasn't extreme like that, but it had all the trademarks of a cult. The church has long denied that publicly, but Brooke says it disbanded years ago. She says there are cults all around us in the Valley in many forms, which is why she believes her podcast can be healing for so many people.
You should be in environments where you're making the decisions for yourself about your life.
Already, she's recorded multiple podcasts using her story as a way to connect to others. And ultimately, she hopes to help anyone learn how to leave a cult.
You're leaving all your friends behind. You're leaving your probably means of living behind. Like, leaving a cult is a really hard thing.
It's a really hard thing. And now let's bring in Brooke Walker to talk more about this. Thank you, Brooke, for joining us to dive into this. When I first approached you about joining us on Newsmaker to dive into this, we both agreed that 3-minute story there, it was a good 3-minute synopsis of everything that happened, but there's so much more. I want to go to the beginning. You were raised in this, what you call a cult. How did your parents get involved in this? What was it like as a kid?
So we joined when I was about 8 years old, and we originally moved from Texas to Maryland, and then from Maryland we moved to Arizona and became part of the church. And so they had met the church leaders because they used to travel around the country, and they would do she was a trance medium, and so she would trance the spirit that she tranced, and then they would do workshops that were like relationship workshops. And so they grew a relationship with them, and they looked at joining the church as being a place that they could raise their family with like-minded people. And I think that once they got in, it was a little bit of a bait and switch, and then they were too far in to figure out how to get out of it, I think is kind of what happened.
And those trances that you talk about, from an outsider's perspective, they feel a little off, right? Did they at any point feel a little off to you when you were in those moments? Or because you grew up with it, was it just, this is what you did on a Friday?
Well, see, that's the thing, is like things that are not necessarily normal can be very normalized when you grow up with them. And yes, for me, I would say there was a level of normalness to it. It wasn't, the one thing I would say though is that we as people, like, I think that we have an innate knowing when things are wrong. And there was many things that happened while being a part of the church that went against how I felt it should have, but I was trained for so long to override that and to override, my gut instincts.
That's so interesting. The Tonto Village, when you all moved up there, what was that like? Was everyone required to live there? Did that shift in the church culture?
So originally it congregated down in Mesa, but because of the lawsuits, and they were always in lawsuits with different people, and pretty much they were very litigious in suing their neighbors. So they began moving towards Tonto Village because the woman who was the medium, she had grown up there and had family there and had a family home there. So there was a couple houses that were already owned. And then, I want to say there was maybe 20 to 30 families, depending on how you break it up, that all slowly began to move up in that direction. And, there was a lot of living with different families, living with different couples, and you lived wherever you were told to live, and it could happen any day that they would switch around all the houses and move everybody around. And it was very tactical. Looking back, I feel like it was tactical, and it was also, I think, a form of chaos that kept you from realizing that you needed to get out of there.
And everything seemed to be about that when I talked to you about this, especially relationships. you were in an arranged marriage. It seemed like I pretty much everyone was that grew up within that church. And how did they control your relationship?
So I think that one of the overarching things about a cult is that they have so much impact on every part of your life. And this church was very, very specific in doing that in all these different areas. So they manipulated the relationships and the friendships and the people that you hung out with, which were only other people in the church. And then you lived with the same people, and then you worked with a lot of the same people because there was a lot of businesses that were owned and run by different members of the church. And so it was like this contained unit that constantly fed on each other, but also like kept everybody in check. And so if there was something going on with like me when I was married, with me and my husband, it wasn't just what happened with me and him at home. It was what happened with me and him and what happened with him at work and whoever happened to say something about that, or if he happens to mention something to a friend, like it all came back, and then it all got told to the ministers, and then that would get used in the trances, and that would get used in what they called processes. And there was nothing private.
Depending on how you define cult, and that is such a big question for so many experts out there, they all struggle with that. One thing's clear though, there's thousands and thousands of them still. They still operate in America. Everyone pretty much universally agrees with that in some way, shape, or form. Now, this church, it's long been disbanded. They long disputed that they were ever a cult. They long fought against that. We struggle to get in touch with anybody still associated with that cult. Your podcast, though, has really connected with a lot of people. Have you heard from anybody else who was a member of this church since that said, oh, you know, let's get in touch, let's talk again? Did it spark any memories, conversations?
You know, it's been really interesting, the handfuls of people that have reached out to me and said that they were a part of the Church of Immortal Consciousness at one time, and it was often referred to as the collective, and that they were a part of it, and that they experienced a lot of similar things, that hearing my podcast was very validating, and that they've thanked me, which is kind of a bizarre feeling. Like, I did this for this, like I wanted to be able to have an impact and help other people heal. I just didn't think there'd be so many people who were affected by the Church of Immortal Consciousness and the ministers there. And it's so long lasting stuff too, because some of these people were there way before we ever were there. So we're talking, 40 years or more.
It has to feel like it matters, though, when you hear from those people that by putting out this podcast, which I've listened to plenty of them, they're emotional, often emotional journeys, but you put it all out there because you feel like it matters, right?
I feel like I want to have the authenticity so that I can make the impact, because I feel like this is a subject that there's so much shame. And yes, it is incredibly validating to have people reach out to me and say, and to thank me. And it keeps me going too. I do enjoy the podcast, but sharing this level of intimacy about my life is not an easy thing. So I took a little break for Christmas and the holidays this year, and then we'll start up with season 2 in January of 2025.
That's season 2. How do people find you on season 2?
How to Leave a Cult. It's on YouTube. It's on, I'm on all the social medias, but you can find it on all the places you can find podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, How to Leave a Cult.
Brooke, thank you so much for being a part of this. I know we only scratched the surface still, even though we had a longer conversation here. So if anyone's interested in this, in cults in general, but also if you have a friend who you think might be a member of a cult, you're trying to help, something like that, it's a really valuable resource to hear from you listening to that podcast. So thank you so much, Brooke. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Thanks for joining us on this week's Newsmaker. We'll see you back again in 2025. Have a great new year.